Welcome to video lesson number 3 in Fundamentals of Community Living Philosophy. This is our third and final video in this portion of the course, and it's all about the central community living principles in a more in-depth way. A quick note of advice. Because unlike the last video, the questions come all at the end in this particular video, it's a really brilliant idea to keep notes as you go along. And in particular, you'll help yourself if you start thinking of examples of the principles in action, times that you or somebody else you work with has done something that represented the principles in the video in a great way. In order to do that, you probably will need to pause and occasionally rewind. And as always, I want to encourage you to reach out to me by text, call, or email if you have any questions or if anything here is not clear. The work we're going to be doing is predicated in some fundamental beliefs that have not always been true and are still not true universally around the world in terms of how we see people with intellectual or developmental differences. The first of these is that we are accepting the axiom that all people, regardless of the presence of a disability, are unique and valuable and should be valued as members of our community. Number two, that the underpinnings of quality of life are the same for all people, irrespective of their developmental differences. And these things include such basic ingredients as safety, wellness, love, self-esteem, freedom, fun, and growth. Number three, we accept the premise that our communities are improved when they are diverse, that everybody being in community makes the community better for everybody. And number four, that we should treat other people as we would like to be treated. The golden rule is seen as an axiom or an accepted principle for us. All right, let's start looking at a specific principle. You'll notice whenever we do this that on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see the definition of the principle. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some questions that can be used as tests, both for yourself or others, to see whether or not a person's practices align with or are in accordance with the principle. Our first principle is called safety, or sometimes referred to as mitigation of risk. What it says is that you must do your job in a way that minimizes any risk to others, not just the supported individual, but any other stakeholder, including your coworkers, your employer as an entity, or stakeholders such as family or neighbors. Risk doesn't just mean risk to the physical safety of a person, it also includes their financial affairs and their legal affairs. If you did something that might get somebody in trouble with the law, you'd be violating this principle. And finally, their reputational safety. So for example, if you were helping a person to publish things online that might damage their reputation or the reputation of your employer, again, you'd be violating this principle. Rarely, but sometimes, you'll come across scenarios where you cannot simply come up with enough measures to truly mitigate risk. And so you'll have to say, no, I can't help you with this. An example of this is if somebody says they want to go cliff diving. If you went cliff diving, there'd be really no way to make sure a person was safe enough to conduct that activity. And so you'd have to go and find some other way of meeting the underlying need. If a person wants to try diving, we might go to a swimming pool and dive into a facility that we could be certain was designed for diving. How can we test it? Some of the questions we might ask: was the work done in a way that was unnecessarily dangerous? Now, it's not possible to eliminate all possible risk, so we're looking for unnecessary danger. An example of this might be a person driving a van without doing the pre-trip inspection. Were all reasonable precautions taken? For example, did a person check somebody's medication records before they gave the medicines? Or thirdly, was dangerous work undertaken for no good reason? For example, did a person go out and start doing stunts or tricks in a vehicle that was owned by the agency and it wasn't necessary to do that? Our next principle is one that is frequently discussed in community living and is very, very important, but is rarely defined, and that is dignity. Dignity can be thought of as all the other parts of wellness besides our physical safety. I like to use the model of the Ojibwe medicine wheel to help get a picture of what it looks like when a person is well. You'll notice that they defined wellness as this four-legged stool where balance is achieved in terms of our body, which is the safety we described a few moments ago, but also our mind, spirit, and emotions. So dignity can be thought of as the emotional, spiritual, and social well-being of supported persons, and it needs to be considered in the exact same way, the exact same weighting as you do with physical safety. We cannot simply say that we're going to do no harm to people physically, which is a medical concept. We have to think in what's called a psychosocial realm, which involves helping people to be well in a holistic way, helping to venture into parts of their lives where all of these ingredients are going to be enriched. So this principle demands of us that we do certain things, but it's more obvious to us when people don't do things that are dignified. So some of the tests we might look for include, did a worker knowingly or carelessly cause the humiliation of a supported person? Now this is an important thing because the idea of knowingly or not taking due care can be difficult to pin down. And so what I would basically say is that if a person has a reasonable expectation that they would not be treated this way themselves, then they should not be treating others that way. Would the actions of the worker be typically considered disrespectful? And did the worker apply personal moral judgment to others? For example, if we apply our personal religious beliefs to other people, that would be an example here. There are some associated concepts with dignity that I'd like to explore in more detail. And the first of these is dignity of risk. So I want to make sure that I'm clear in saying that dignity of risk is a part of the larger conversation of dignity, not the only conversation. One of the basic ideas behind this concept is that there is dignity in taking risks, not just physical risks, but risks across the spectrum of our wellness. For example, if you go on a date, you're taking an emotional and social risk. If you undertake a course at school, you're taking a mental and emotional risk. If you invest money, you're taking a financial risk. But in each case, you're doing that because it will enhance your well-being and your quality of life. That risk is an essential part of making our dignity and our wellness enhanced. And it's also important to understand that failure and adversity are not automatically bad things. That when we fail, particularly if we are surrounded by people and resources that support us, we can often emerge happier and more strong. So failure is a part of growth. It's also important to realize that dignity of risk is not just about letting a person do whatever they want. We must still attend to our first principle of mitigation of risk. A way that I like to do this is by having an equation in my mind of whether or not a person will gain dignity without undue necessary risk. So, for example, if a person says, I want to run across the highway, I would not see much of an increase in dignity in that, and I would see a very high degree of risk or potential harm in that. On the other hand, if a person told me they wanted to go skiing, this is still a risky activity, but it's very easy to see how that's an enhancing experience for a person in terms of their physical, social, and emotional well-being. So if we can see a way that a person's dignity might be gained, our job is to make sure that we help them to do that in a way that is going to enhance their dignity and still minimize unnecessary risk. Dignity also talks about two other important concepts. The first of these is called the principle of least intrusion, which simply means we should invade the other person's life to the lowest degree possible. This includes invading all forms of privacy. Now, we're going to talk about privacy in more detail later in the video, but there is an unbreakable connection between privacy and dignity, and this principle addresses it. It also means that we should not interfere in or try to replace relationships between supported people and unpaid individuals in their lives. We're not there to mediate relationships with girlfriends or interfere in relationships with family members. It also means we shouldn't work in areas where we aren't needed. For example, if a person is completely capable of their own personal care, then we should simply stay out of that area. The principle of least restriction is about making sure we do not put unnecessary controls or limits on a person. It includes giving people lots of opportunities for choice and freedom, and by gradually expanding the opportunity for people to have more and more of those choices and freedoms. It also, as we said before, respects the ability of people to make mistakes and to learn from failure. We shouldn't keep people from doing things because we think they might not be successful. We should instead put our energies into helping them be successful and being supportive and helping them to learn if they have gone through failures or hardships. Our next important concept and principle is person-centeredness and empowerment. It says that you must facilitate supported persons in choices based on what they value and what is functional for them, meaning what works for them, even if you do not personally share the same values. For example, let's say you have a value around sexuality. You are not to apply your personal value to somebody else if their choices would be different than yours. Another idea here is that the supported person's values have primacy, meaning that they come first in all planning. Sometimes when I teach this to people, they perceive that to mean that they should create a competition or rivalry between the supported person and others in their circle of support, such as other agencies and staff, or more commonly, their family. But that's not what we're saying. It's entirely appropriate to encourage people to engage in dialogue and collaboration and to see if they can find common ground around the values that they share and the directions that a person may take in their lives. And that's particularly difficult to do, or particularly important to do, I should say, when an individual is not able to communicate verbally or has some limitations. We really rely upon family and other long-term stakeholders to help us understand what's important to that person. And so we want to make sure that we include them in decision making. However, if we come to a scenario where it's quite clear that the supported person wants something different than others, the supported person's needs and wants come first. The test that we might apply here. Did a worker unreasonably prohibit a supported person from making a personal decision? Did they act in a way that any reasonable person would have seen as an opportunity for a choice, but they didn't give the choice? And did the worker take all reasonable steps to facilitate choice making? And again, this word reasonable is difficult at times to pin down, but I like to again apply the golden rule. What would I have wanted somebody else to do for me in that scenario? Empowering people is an active process. It requires us to do specific things. And in particular, there are 3 things that we need to do. We need to do all of them, and we need to do them all the time. The first of these is called restoring or granting autonomy and authority. Autonomy is the power we have over ourselves. For example, you're probably quite accustomed to choosing your own food or your own bedtime. Those are examples of autonomy. Authority is the power we have over others. Too often we dismiss authority as a bad thing, but in fact, authority is something probably all of us value, and others probably value us for having it too, such as when we're parents, coaches, or teachers. Many of the people we support have very limited autonomy. For example, their bedtimes may not be completely at their choice. And even more missing in people's lives often is opportunities for authority, opportunities to positively influence others. So we need to be creative in looking for ways to expand the amount of autonomy and authority the supported individuals that we're working with have. An example of this might be to demonstrate to people by simply telling them their rights before we go into a particular setting. For example, saying to somebody, we're going to the keg tonight and you can order whatever you want. The second ingredient is to actually teach people the how behind making choices. And it's something that we don't think about as a skill, but there's a lot of social skill, a lot of nuance in making a good choice and expressing it in a way that will likely result in the choice being respected. So we have to actually show and reinforce for people when they're making choices. And this can be difficult because sometimes people make choices with which we don't agree. But we have to find a way still to reward and honor choices even if we don't personally subscribe to them. Help the person to see how their choices will lead to certain outcomes. This can happen in an educational setting or while sitting down and doing something like scheduling, for example, so that a person can see how spending money here might affect their budget elsewhere, or doing something in the morning might affect the time they have for something in the afternoon. So an example here might be teaching a person how they might read a menu and actually place an order, and then making sure that the order actually comes and pointing out to the person the connection between what they did and what they got. The third and final ingredient here is actually providing people with opportunities to exercise their power. In my experience, we're often good at telling people they have choices and even teaching them how to have choices, but we're not as good at getting them out there where they can actually utilize these choices. So it's important for us to ensure that there are ample chances for the person to exercise their power in lots of ways. Small ways, such as determining the amount of food on their plate, or which staff person is going to drive the vehicle on an outing. And in big ways, such as we might see at annual planning. An example here is going to the keg. If we taught the person how to make a choice and told them they could make the choice but never went out and did it, it would be meaningless and soon forgotten. Our next concept is advocacy. Advocacy means that you might be the only person who has the voice for the people you support. So advocacy happens when we speak up for others or act on their behalf. Advocacy is needed sometimes when a particular individual is in harm's way, but it's also needed whenever a principle is violated, even if you cannot see how it will directly impact a specific person. That's called advocating for professionalism. So when people are advocating for better practice, it is an important part of their job. And it's not acceptable to say to somebody, no harm came from my actions, therefore advocacy wasn't needed. They're supposed to advocate for continuous professional conduct, because in the absence of that, we'll see the erosion of standards. And one of the most important things to understand about advocacy is that it's probably most effective when we help people to do it for themselves, when we teach people, using some of the same things we talked about in the last slide, how to speak up for themselves. Self-advocacy is far more effective than when we advocate for other people. So what are some of the things that we should look for in the tests? Did a worker advocate against a supported person or supported persons? Did they say something that was contrary to their rights? Did a worker take reasonable measures to defend against discrimination or harm and to teach the supported person how to do so? For example, telling a person their rights in a public place. Did a worker report suspected abuse? That's an example of advocacy. Note that advocacy is a very common tool. It's needed often even within our own teams. And so we have to really be open and even grateful to people who are paying attention to what we're doing as a team and who say at things like staff meetings, hey, you guys, I think we can improve. If we take that with personal offense, we're actually standing in the way of this very important principle. Some of the human rights we want people to understand and that are universal include our democratic rights. For example, people, irrespective of their intellectual ability, are allowed to vote. Language rights, the ability to speak your language of origin. Equality rights, such as the ability to access public places, to have jobs, or to rent. Legal rights, such as the ability to be tried in person or to have a lawyer. Mobility rights, the right to go anywhere in the community. Freedom of religion, including the freedom to have no religion or to have religious values that are different than others in our own family. Freedom of expression, including sexual expression, so people can be whatever sexuality they wish to be. And freedom of assembly and association. For example, freedom to have friends, even if you don't personally like the friends of that individual, or to be a part of certain groups, again, no matter whether we agree or disagree. Advocacy is always about making sure that people have these rights served, so it's important to understand these rights on a granular level. Our next important principle is privacy. But the truth is there isn't just one type of privacy. Privacy is actually better thought of as three specific principles. So let's take a moment to define them. The first principle is confidentiality. Confidentiality can be thought of as informational privacy. It means taking care of private information, whether it's in a verbal format, written, or in a digital format, such as an email. It doesn't just refer to the sharing of that information, but the way that we store it, or even how we manage copies, for example, after we've finished having a planning meeting. It doesn't just refer to the information about supported people. It includes all stakeholders, such as coworkers, and even your agency's private documents are considered to be their possessions. Body privacy is the next area. Body privacy includes things like the medical procedures given to people, and even medications, any type of touch and personal space, and of course sexual behavior such as leering at a person or looking down their clothing. And again, this includes colleagues and coworkers, not just supported people. And ownership is the principle that we have a degree of privacy in our possessions and personal spaces. If you've ever had somebody steal something from you, you probably said something like it felt violating, because it's an invasion of our privacy to have people mistreat our personal belongings. And again, this has to do with our employers, colleagues, and coworkers, not just supported people. Let's investigate confidentiality in more detail. This principle says that you can only share personal information about a supported person or other stakeholders, such as family or a coworker, when others have a need to know in order to work with you or protect a person's safety, or when the person gives consent. So let's say you are supporting an individual who says they are suicidal, but they ask you not to tell others. You would not only be okay to share that information in your organization, but you'd be expected to do that to provide for the safety and welfare of that person. On the other hand, if a person told you that their birthday was coming up, but asked you not to share that, you would not be allowed to share it. They haven't given permission, and it's not something that others need to know, even if you personally consider it to be a little bit of information and not a big deal. Internal sharing within your organization is generally accepted if it's done on a need-to-know basis. So let's say a day program and a group home both support an individual, and they share information so that their service quality is good. That's typically considered to be quite okay if they're in the same organization. Let's say a different organization provides the day programming and another organization provides the residential programming. The two organizations should have some kind of signed release that lets them share information between them. Within the province of BC, we have the Freedom of Information and Privacy Protection Act that stipulates how information can be shared across organizations. And one of the most basic things we can do is make sure that we comply with that law. So here are some tests. Did a worker unnecessarily share private information about supported persons, colleagues, or employers? Unnecessarily being the important word. On the alternative, or did they share information without consent? So we can share information that might be not terribly important if a person says it's okay or signs off on it. Did a worker fail to properly secure or store private information? For example, I had a staff person who left an individual's binder on the front seat of their car in plain daylight. When their car was broken into, somebody stole the file. If they had put that file into a trunk, it would have been considered to be secure. Did a worker distribute private information in a careless fashion? For example, did they send it from their home computer, which indicates that maybe other people might have been able to see it? Our next concept under privacy is body privacy. This principle states that we must seek informed consent before invading a person's personal space, such as standing really close to them, or touching them, such as we might do if we were helping a person in the bathtub. Informed consent means that we give people the information they need in a way that will be reasonable for them to understand, and then get permission. We don't have to check for understanding, but we do have to take reasonable steps to deliver information in a way that will likely be understood. We also need informed consent before giving any medical procedure, and this includes giving people medicines. And we have to maintain permission throughout the procedure. So if people refuse to have us support them in the bath, even if we've already started, we'll need to respect that direction and find somebody else or end the bath. Similarly, if people refuse their medicines, we have to stop the procedure. This principle also says that you may not use restraint or isolation on a person except where specified in an individualized and approved protocol. Now, these protocols are very, very rare. When they do occur, it's under extraordinary circumstances, and typically the documents are carefully vetted by social workers and physicians, and they are regularly reviewed so that they can be reduced or eliminated at the soonest possible opportunity. So if you're locking a person in a room or holding a door with somebody locked inside, or you're wrapping them in a hold, unless there's a specific procedure or unless you can prove that this was necessary for the maintenance of safety and done in the most minimal way, it is likely you are behaving in a way that violates this principle. Here are some of the tests. Did a worker perform a procedure on a supported person without permission or after permission was withdrawn? Did a worker behave in a way that was outside of established procedures for that person when it came to personal care? In other words, it's usually the case, and it should be the case, that where you work describes in some form, usually written, how personal care is to be done for a person, and you're expected to work in alignment with that. Did a worker perform medical or personal care activity without the other person being aware and informed? An example might be if you went into a person's bathroom and watched from a closet without them knowing, or if you put a pill in some jam and gave it to them without them knowing. Did a worker restrain, lock in, or forcibly isolate another person? Again, unless there's a very specific protocol and unless that protocol is followed, We never should be doing these things. They not only constitute unethical behavior, but they also represent a violation of BC's laws around physical abuse and neglect. The third part of privacy is ownership. This principle says that we must treat the possessions of other people in the workplace, particularly supported people, with the exact same degree of care that you would expect others to take with your possessions. You must treat personal spaces like bedrooms, bathrooms, closets, and storage spaces, wallets, and purses as extensions of that supported person's body. You need to seek informed consent before you enter any of these private spaces, and if the person withdraws their permission, you must leave. And we never borrow, buy, or steal a supported person's personal belongings. And you'll notice it doesn't say that you can borrow something with a person's permission. Because of a conflict of interest that arises from a power differential, people may give us permission even though they may not be absolutely comfortable in doing that. So it's a bad practice for us to borrow things even if the person has told us it's okay to do so. In essence, we have to treat the property as though it was our own. And this extends to property belonging to our co-workers and our employer, such as the vehicles you drive. You must do that the exact same way as you would with the supported people's property as identified above. Some tests. Did a worker treat the possessions of a supported person in a careless fashion? That would be evidence of violating this principle. Did the worker fail to properly secure private possessions and spaces? For example, leaving money out that belongs to a supported person where it can be easily stolen would violate this principle. Did a worker enter or refuse to leave a private space without the permission of an individual? And did a worker steal or borrow a supported person's personal possession? Those would all be examples of violating this principle. Our next principle is called accountability. When I ask people to define accountability, they almost always tell me that it means responsibility, but that's only half of what it means. Responsibility plus openness is what we mean by accountability. And that means that if we make a mistake, we may still continue to demonstrate responsibility by being open if people have questions or want to see records of what's gone on. So we must be open and responsible for all aspects of the supported person's service. This includes accurately and timely record keeping, such as financial records and daily reports. It also means being open and truthful anytime anybody has questions for you or investigations, even of an informal nature. So, how do we test for this? Did the worker provide accurate and timely records, for example, after an incident report or at the end of a shift, or your medication sheets? Was the worker honest, available, and responsive to others who had questions? So, for example, if a family member asks you to return a call, that's an example of being accountable. Or if your supervisor asks you why the timesheet wasn't properly signed or why a medication record wasn't initialed, you're expected to answer in a timely fashion. And of course, if you hide or misrepresent information, that's considered an automatic violation of this principle. Okay, well, we're getting close to wrapping up this video, but before we do, there are 3 other principles I'd like to touch on very quickly. The first of these is consultation and collaboration. This principle says that we essentially have to work in a team. This means working with other people, including the supported person and non-professionals such as their family and friends, to come up with the most comprehensive and individualized plan of services we possibly can. It also means working with people from other disciplines, particularly when we know something is outside of our area of expertise. So it could be doctors, lawyers, police officers, or teachers, but we have to bring those people in when we know we're outside of our depth. The next one is adaptability and growth. We know that people's needs will evolve over time, and this principle simply says that we need to change along with them, both as individuals and as agencies. We need to keep learning and improving and do that in an active way. And if people leave our services, we need to support them in transition. We don't simply close the door behind them, but we want to make sure that people have continued success. And this often looks like reaching out to the receiving organization to do some planning and maintaining a connection that lasts for a little while. Finally, personal fitness. This means that we have an ethical responsibility to maintain our own wellness. And in the same way as we define wellness for supported people using the medicine wheel, that applies to us. So our physical wellness is just part of the equation. Our psychological, emotional, and social wellness are also part of that equation. So we have to show up at work equipped to do the job. And this means having a little bit of extra in our tank. And if we can't do that, it's time for us to enlist supports. Some of those supports are afforded to you by your employer, things like sick days, employee assistance plans, or leaves of absence. And others might be things that you arrange in your own life. They can be formal things like counseling or medical treatment, or they can be informal things like your workout routine or walking in the forest if that's what helps you to maintain mindfulness and wellness. Whatever it is that you need to do, that's part of our ethical responsibility. Okay, it's time for us to move on to our journal questions. And we've got two here, but they're going to take you a bit of time. So the first is this. For each principle below, describe an example when you have used a practice that upheld that particular principle. And if you can't think of one, or you can think of a better example from a coworker, go ahead and use that example. But make sure you do so in a way that upholds confidentiality. Please don't use any real names or anything that would identify a person. So there's the list of our principles that we've covered: safety, dignity, empowerment, advocacy, the three different types of privacy, and accountability. When you're done with that, your last journal question will ask you to go back and look at your organization's policy and procedures manual. You could probably access much of what we're talking about through the internet and the website. What are the fundamental principles of your organization, and which of these matter most to you, and why? Take a moment to write me a paragraph about that. When you're all done, send this all to me in one package to the email address you were provided at the beginning of these slides. And I'll have a chance to look at them, to send you feedback, and to arrange for our in-person video conference session. And from those answers in your journal, I will shape that program to fit your needs and move forward. Thanks so much for participating, and I look forward to hearing from you.